Let's talk to Billy Riggs. He's a professor in autonomous transport at the University of San Francisco, and I think it's fair to say San Francisco is the city where it's happening more than anywhere else on the planet when it comes to autonomy. But I'm going to be, I don't think, particularly controversial here, Billy, by saying that I think shared mobility, last mile, shuttles, that sort of autonomous technology is coming far quicker and getting more embraced than the Cruise, Waymo kind of replacement for the human-driven private car. Would you agree with that?
I think it's an interesting way to kind of classify the vehicle types. I don't think Cruise and Waymo have a vision for their product as being a replacement for the private car. Both companies actually want to pursue a shared platform. So if anything, we're going to see, and we are seeing in San Francisco, both Cruise and Waymo start to gravitate towards putting more people in more vehicles to maximize the people miles traveled and more revenue, because there's more people in those vehicles yielding more revenue. There's opportunities for shared platforms in the future, but they're starting even kind of to use these Chevy Bolt or this Jaguar I-Pace to carry multi-passenger vehicles. And one thing I think we have to keep in mind from a city planning standpoint is, the topic of shared mobility it shouldn't preclude the idea of reducing vehicle ownership. Uber or Lyft, those vehicles, if they can prevent someone from actually owning a car, I think it's still, that ride pooling solution still actually could reduce auto dependency. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But I don't think I'd frame it as kind of a binary that Cruise or Waymo are the level 4 vehicles in San Francisco, that they're not pursuing a potentially shared fleet future. They actually are, just the same as a Zoox or a Baidu or some of these other kind of companies are looking at.
So where do you think the shared mobility, kind of what we would call driverless pod solution, is at the moment, and how is that affecting the take-up and the ridership across the whole of public transportation?
Well, the data that we have right now shows that pretty clearly that dedicated transit riders stick with transit because it's still more efficient at making many everyday trips. That whether or not you get in a Waymo or a Cruise or a rideshare vehicle, or you drive your own car, that drive is still going to be a little longer for some trips, even than actually taking the bus or a train. It's also going to be less efficient from a environmental standpoint, as well as a parking standpoint. It's going to be really expensive. So I think we're seeing, by and large, that those passengers aren't the customers that Cruise and Waymo are getting. The passengers primarily we're seeing a pivot between traditional rideshare or traditional ride pool and those level 4 automation companies. So people going from traditional rideshare like Uber to actually taking a Waymo. What's interesting is to whether or not Uber and Lyft and the ride-sharing companies start to have partnerships where they are managing the front end of the autonomous ride. And we're already starting to see that with Uber kind of collapsing its product in certain market and allowing for Waymo rides, for example. And that's happening in Arizona as well as Los Angeles.
And your session was lessons learned when it comes to robo-taxis and shuttles. Summarize as best you can what the lessons have been learned.
Well, you hit on one of the key lessons, which is the implications for public transit agencies in terms of reducing ridership is not as significant as I think some people feared. And yet the opportunity it presents to bring new riders and provide the last mile solution, very clearly it could fill in gaps in the network. There's also an opportunity to really think about reframing the physical environment in terms of pickup and drop off. One of the critical things and points of tension we see is increased rideshare behavior and therefore increased tension and competition for the curb. Increased competition for what traditionally has been a quote unquote transit pickup and drop off space. And if we're reframing the idea of what is transit for that last portion of, or that first portion of a trip, then really something we have to think about is how we better transact at the origin and the destination, at the start and the beginning of that trip. And usually that's at a curb in urban condition. And so there's a lot of lessons in terms of how we manage data, but also space availability at the curbs, and a lot of opportunity still for invention. When we think about the future of automation, it doesn't mean that you stop planning the street right-of-way for bicycles, pedestrians, and transit. So a lot of people think, well, we should just, how does that relate to how we're planning for multimodal mobility? And if anything, I think automated vehicles suggest that we need to move into a future of planning cities for people and also planning more car-free areas that actually can facilitate carbon-less or carbon-light travel, where automated vehicles can fill in the gaps and maybe help the cost effectiveness of public transit and support high capacity transit routes. But at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that you shortcut or you stop actually emphasizing primary walking and cycling trips.
Final question. You live in the Bay Area.
I do.
How often do you use either a Waymo or a cruise?
Yeah, it's funny, Paul. If we were in the Bay Area and you said let's go for a cruise ride, I would say, or let's go for a Waymo, I would say, let's meet at this bar and we'll go for a ride. And you would see me walking up and I had just been gotten off the bus. So I would say about 5% of the time I'll use a Waymo or a cruise. So 95% of the time I'm actually taking transit because it's more efficient. And for me at least, I have the luxury of living in a high density transit area. That's a luxury that not everyone has, and that's something that I know, being a person of privilege, that I have the privilege of public transit access. Certain people in my own city don't have that access, and so I see a lot of opportunity for reaching populations that have been marginalized, places in the city that have been underinvested in transit infrastructure. I see that as a huge opportunity for enriching the transit density of areas that have been underinvested in and giving them the same opportunity to connect it to rail that I have. And so that's really some of the promise of automation that I hope for.